Well, thank you, Paul, for those kind words, and thank you all for inviting me today. I really appreciate it. As Paul said, my name's Alan Smith, and yes, I retired from the Army in January of last year at the rank of Major, having started off as a young soldier back in 1974. So 49 years later, they kicked me out, said, you're too old now, get out, and move on. And I was very fortunate to do quite a number of things through my Army career, including chasing some flying. And yes, I did attend the first flying training school at Point Cook way back in the 70s, and did the Army pilot's course there. But I had also done my private pilot's licence as a teenager, flying out of, doing it in Brisbane. And I was chasing after my dad, I guess, in a way. So a little bit of background there. I'm going to cover a bit more of that right near the end, but just a quick touch of the flying history. So there's my grandfather, Francis Ryan Smith, Frank, flying in World War I. My father flew in World War II with the Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force. He flew Beaufighters and then he flew Beauforts on his second tour. He then, through another completely different story, ended up in the Army, went to Korea, and afterwards, when he was about to be promoted to WO1 and become the second RSM of the SAS, they were starting up Army aviation. And he had kept his Air Force wings current, even as a private soldier, so in the Army. So they were starting up Army aviation. They asked him to come across here in Sydney, and then he took them to Amberley. And he ended up as the operations officer of both the aviation school and the first, and at that time the only aviation regiment, and through to when it became a corps. So we grew up at Amberley Air Base, and then he went on to establish Oki, and that's a link back to the family for Toowoomba. And he established the Oki Air Base, and then they retired him on age. And then I followed shortly thereafter. So, and I became a pilot, and as it turns out, my son's also a pilot. So I guess it was in the blood. But let's get on with Frank. So my plan today, I'm going to cover this in basically three main areas. And noting the audience that I'm speaking to, I would be surprised if you were not aware of at least some part of this guy's history, and certainly of what the Australian Flying Corps was about and what they did. So I'm going to skip through a bit of this, but I do elaborate a little bit on his history. But to give some background on Frank, I think it's important to understand how he got to the Flying Corps. So we'll cover that first part through his enlistment and the early years of his wartime service that then led him into joining the Australian Flying Corps sometime later. Then we'll talk about his operations during there and his honours and awards. And then what happened after the war, and that might raise a few more questions. Because as you can see there, we talk about what's recorded history and what is family history. And I'll raise up here, one of my key references is this biography. It's actually on the website. It's written by Peter Nelson, a fellow down in Bendigo. And it's quite detailed, and I learned a hell of a lot about my grandfather reading that. There's a lot of things I didn't know, but then after he and I spoke, he learned a lot of things that he didn't know, and that this article puts at odds. So that'll be an interesting one to cover as we get near the end. But let's start with him kicking off as a young man. He was approaching 19, and he convinced his dad that he wanted to join the AIF, and his dad finally relented and gave consent, and off he went and he enlisted in the AIF. And he joined A Company of the 31st Battalion, which was a new battalion just getting started, raised in Brisbane, and they ended up at Enoggera Barracks in Brisbane. Coincidentally, that was my first posting also, Enoggera Barracks. But he was an infantryman, I'm a cavalryman, so a little bit of a difference there. So he joined up 30th of July was his official enlistment date of 1915, and you'll see there that he was already on his sergeant's promotion exams coming up in September of that same year. So it was all pretty quick. Things are moving, and they often do when you're first raising new regiments, and there's a bit of wartime pressure. And he got through those exams quite well, and he was promoted sergeant on the 16th of September. and he returned back to A Company in the 31st Battalion and served on through there. They then went on and moved to Melbourne via Sydney, caught the train down, and they ended up in Broadmeadows. And they joined up with two other companies, C and D companies, which were Victorians, and that then made the battalion whole. That's a picture of him as a young lieutenant. It's a little bit later in the war. That's in 1917. Quite a young, good-looking rooster back then, unlike me. So they embarked on Her Majesty's transport ship Wandilla on the 9th of November 1915, and they headed off to the Suez. And they remained in that Suez for a few months in there, doing a number of canal defence operations. I don't believe they saw too much action in that period, but they were certainly moved around up there and up into the Sinai, and that's where he got his initial contact. He was already starting to establish himself at this point as a bit of a go-getter. Fairly quiet, calm sort of a guy. He's only quite a small man in many regards. When he enlisted, he stood at 5'9" and he weighed 127 pounds. So in the current money, that's probably a touch under 60 kilos. So it's pretty small. Maybe a bit advantageous in the aircraft because they weren't terribly big in those cockpits. But he showed a level of aggression and some leadership, and that's probably what picked him up for his sergeant's exam so quickly and stood him in good stead with the company afterwards. And then he showed again in those operations as he went through that period there in the Suez. And then they moved into France. They went up through into the Fromelles region, and this is where it really started to get pretty hairy. On the 19th of July, as it says up there, 19th of July, 6 p.m, the Fromelles action started. Let me say here that this was not a particularly well-planned, well-conceived operation, and ultimately it paid the penalty for that poor planning. So they went at 6 o'clock that night, and the battalion actually did pretty well in their first engagement. They got to the first set of German trenches, fighting their way in there, and it was led off with A and B companies. Sorry, A and I think the other one was C. It was one of the Victorian companies. So Frank here was right in the vanguard of the assault. By the early hours of the next morning, these guys were starting to run low on ammunition. They needed some reinforcements, and the Germans started their counterattacks. And there was a whole series of them starting in the very early hours of the morning and went right through to daylight. These guys, again, running out of ammunition. There were no reinforcements coming up, and they were starting to really take some wounded and killed. And then the flanks started to fold. And 31 Battalion found that they had to get out of there or they were going to get encircled and overrun. So they pulled themselves out. And the commanding officer of the battalion was a fellow by the name of Colonel Toll. Another little coincidence, when I went to 1st Armoured Regiment as a young lieutenant, my CO was Colonel Toll. I don't know if there's a relation there, but it's not a very common name, unlike mine, so there you go. Now, as you can see there in the post-operational report, this is what happened to the battalion. 152 officers and men killed, or they were missing, a number missing. 421 wounded. That's a hell of a whack on a battalion, and not much left. But Frank was still there and unwounded at this point. But he had distinguished himself in that period. And whilst the CO noted in his very detailed report, he felt that almost every member of the battalion had gone above and beyond, but he was asked to make some recommendations for awards. And he found it, and he wrote in his report how difficult it was to identify those people out. So part of it was they would represent the others that didn't come back. And Frank was one of those that put up for the award. So 7 officers, 3 senior NCOs, including a warrant officer, and 4 other ranks, so corporals. and 2 privates in there. All of them received awards except Frank, and I can't find any record as to why he didn't pick up an award when all the others did. Perhaps his award was just a little bit later when they promoted him to second lieutenant, and he was made platoon commander of 3 Platoon A Company. So the war goes on, and they move to Fromelles and then on to Armentieres. And along that line, they eventually established themselves in a place called the Chicken Run. And along the front there, they had a series of names like the Chicken Run. And in this case, about 40 metres in front of them on the German side was a series of small huts that were actually chicken huts. And there was a chicken run in there. And hence that particular sector became known as the Chicken Run. And it's interesting when you read on it that on both sides, Germans and the Australians, every now and then in a lull in the fighting, they'd be out trying to get into no man's land and shoot themselves some chickens. And this is the way they supplemented their diet, of fresh food. Of course, they weren't using 22s, were they? They had some decent-sized weaponry in there, so there wasn't a real lot of the chicken left, I would imagine. Hit by a couple of machine gun rounds or a couple of 303 rounds or similar. Not a lot of chicken left, but still. And they would go out and pull them out of no man's land, and it was almost like you didn't shoot at each other while you were shooting the chickens. And that's how they supplemented themselves. But as they moved through that period, it was decided that the Australians were going to be pulled out and they were going to go to the Somme, more into the Somme area. So they were spread pretty thinly across that front, and the divisional commander wanted to maintain the illusion as long as possible that there was still a reasonable sized force manning these trenches in that line. And one of the ways he did that was through a series of bombardments. So there was artillery, mortar, they would do gassings, and they would run trench raids. Now the trench raids was usually a fairly smallish team affair, 20, 30, about roughly platoon size. They'd dash across no man's land, jump into the forward, fight their way into a forward pit, go along that trench line, up and down, create as much havoc as possible, try and take some prisoners, see if they had any documents lying around, and then bolt like hell back across the other side before the Germans could launch a counterattack. And most of these trench raids would last around 10 minutes. So it was in, hit as hard as hell, try and shock them around a bit, and then get the hell out of there. But it gave that illusion that there was a lot going on. Heading towards October, they decided that they were going to move, but the divisional commander actually wanted to increase this illusion. So the night before they were due to move, or the night of the move, which is around the 12th of October, he got them to do a series of raids. And leading up in that, about 2 weeks before, Frank had put his hand up and said, look, I would like to lead a raid from the battalion, but I want to make it a bigger one. And I actually want to go in there and do some real damage. So the CO, having briefed the divisional commander through the brigade commander, the divisional commander thought that was a bloody good idea. So one of those 12 raids was led by Frank, and he took 105 people with him. And as they climbed out of their pits, bombardment going on, they laid down ready to assault, and as that lifted, they would then charge across. Wouldn't you know it, luck has it, just as they're about to lift the bombardment and run, German bombardment hits, and Frank gets hit in the foot. He got hit in the left foot. And as he got hit, he was looking at his watch and he went, we've got to launch. So he just stood up and launched anyway. And they assaulted in. And the 105 of them dashed in, and they killed approximately 100 Germans. They captured another 10, created absolute havoc for 45 minutes. Which meant they would have beaten off a couple of the counterattacks from the Germans, who were pretty shocked at such a large force coming into their trenches, and then they beat their way out of there. They lost about 3 dead and a few wounded, about, I believe something like about 20 wounded. And then when they got back, that's when he succumbed to the wound on his foot and he couldn't walk anymore. And Frank was actually evacuated back, and he ended up back in Southampton in hospital where they removed the shrapnel out of his foot. Now, while that was going on and he was getting out of there, the divisional commander had seen the raids, and in particular that one, and said, wow, that was pretty terrific. And so he put the guys up for some awards, and this is where Frank picked up his MC. And just give me a moment while I turn to the page. I'd like to read this one, because this was on the personal recommendation of the divisional commander. No, I can't find it there, but it doesn't matter. It was basically for his leadership and his coolness under fire and the inspiration to the men around him, and kept them going and then got so many of them back, that the divisional commander said that that was an inspiration to the battalion, it was an inspiration to the division, and he truly represented the spirit of Australians. And on that basis, he was awarded the Military Cross for his leadership. And it was a particular mention about how cool and methodical he was in both planning it and then the actual conduct, even though he was wounded at the time. I'll just digress for a moment. We're talking about the coolness and the calmness of the man. My grandfather died when I was 2, so I didn't really know him. I never got to know him. But my mother tells me that he was one of the nicest men that she had ever met, a real gentleman, and he was very quiet. She never once heard him raise his voice. She never saw him angry. He was calm. Apparently it was his wife, my grandmother, who was the angry one, and she was the disciplinarian. From what I've got, the little bit I got out of my dad was his dad never had to say much to him. He just knew he was in trouble. And so Granddad didn't have to say much, he'd just give him a look. Yeah, okay, I know, I'm in trouble. Where my father was quite the opposite sort of guy. So that was Frank all his life. So I'll just give you that little picture there. So then off he went to Southampton, got himself fixed, and then came back with the battalion. And he was back in January of 17. And not long after he got back, the ADC to the Div commander had to disappear for a little while. And so he was looking for a new ADC, and Frank actually got tapped on the shoulder and he went up to be ADC to the Div commander for a short period of time. And in November of the year before, he'd been promoted to lieutenant. So now he's a full lieutenant. He went back to the battalion, back as a platoon commander, and he then served on with them for quite a while. In June of 17, he got some leave and he went back to England, had a bit of time off. Now, at that time, there was a lot going on about the new Australian Flying Corps and how many changes would come out. Now, as you're probably aware, a lot of these guys initially were numbered under the British system, British squadron numbers. But as they raised the AFC and got that going, they then adopted their own numbers. So we ended up with 1, 2, 3 and 4 squadrons. Frank applied and then he got back to his battalion, and then in August he got the word that he'd been approved and accepted. And he headed back to England to undertake his flying training. There were 300 applicants for 13 positions. And he was one of those lucky 13, and off he went. Now, he finished his flying training in December of 17, and he was allocated to 2 Squadron. And then he headed off to France, and he joined up with them in February of 2018. While he was doing his flying training, there's a little piece in here about him having a bit of an altercation with someone in authority. And apparently there was an order that he didn't particularly think was a good one, didn't like it very much, and he pretty much decided he wasn't going to obey that order, and they could go and stick it where the sun don't shine, and he even had an argument with the corporal. Now, yes, he's a lieutenant, and that's only a corporal, but he's one of the instructors. And if any of you have been to any of those sort of training exercises, the staff, doesn't matter what rank you are, you're a student, and you do what the staff tell you. But I think he had enough credibility behind him, having been a soldier, a senior NCO, now a commissioned officer with the MC. That might have saved his butt. And they took no further action, and he was allowed to go on and graduate. And he must have done pretty good on the flying scale. As many of you are probably aware, the loss rate just in training was pretty high. These weren't the best, safest machines around, even though they were probably pretty good in their day, but still not real good. But he got through, obviously, and showed some real skill. Now, something I'd like to just part a little bit again, talk a little bit about some of the other things that Frank did. He was a gifted sportsman. He was a very good cricketer, and actually played at first class. And I'm told that he actually got selected to play for Australia. But then he got all his fingers smashed by a ball, and he wasn't able to play. But that meant he had very good hand-eye coordination. He was also already a very good shot. In growing up, and my dad went through the same thing, and he told me this story with his dad and his uncles, when they were taught to shoot from being quite young, one of the assessments on their marksmanship and their ability to shoot, they go hunting rabbits. But there were two conditions when you hunted them. You could only use a .22 because a bigger one would blow the animal to pieces. So they used a .22, and the two rules with that was it had to be a headshot. Anything other than a headshot didn't count. And the rabbit had to be moving. You couldn't shoot him standing still, he had to be running. Now, I'll bring that into line in a minute. Before he when he first got over to France, one of the first things they did was they sent him over to sniper school. And he actually did the Australian Sniper School. So that's more advanced shooting and the more technical side of shooting. Now, he'd already shown himself to be quite a good marksman and quite a good shot. And those skills he learnt as a young fellow, honed further by his own battlefield skills and battlefield experience, and now coming into flying. What is a lot of that stuff about? Being able to assess the movement, deflection shooting. So you're shooting something on the move, and he had trained since he was a boy to take on moving targets. And also, if any of you done any hunting, particularly trying to shoot rabbits, they're quick, and you never know which direction they're going, and they can change like that. So when you get up, it's not, oh, he's going, now I've got him. He's going up, bang. You've got to be able to identify it, make the assessment, and take the accurate shot within almost milliseconds. You don't have time. And I would say that skill then equates into your flying, because you're certainly hitting a moving target, or you're trying to hit a moving target that's going all over the place, and it's not always easy to assess which way he's going, particularly with some of these aircraft that he did face. And then he's moving as well. So he's moving through those dimensions at the same time. So I'd just like to pull some of that together about where he's come from and how it's come in. And I also have noted that many of the outstanding aces of the war on both sides, let's take into account both the Richtophens, they were hunters. A lot of these guys had grown up shooting. So those skills clearly translated to what they were doing in the air. I'll also temper that a little bit with when they did fire in the air, they found the best thing was to get in really close. So they were very rarely shooting beyond about 200 feet. And if you get to within 50 or 60 feet of the guy, all the better. But that took a hell of a lot of flying to get in there and be there long enough to be able to take a shot without getting shot at yourself. So I'll just throw that in there for the moment. So that's Frank there. This is actually a photo of the squadron, of the officers of the squadron. And that's Frank circled there. And you'll note that he is one of the 3 officers in that front row that are in their flying kit. Shortly after that photo was taken, they were off on a patrol. And just take a look at the kit and how well they were rugged up. In one of his letters to his father, he wrote that even with 6 pairs of socks, it was still bloody cold. And they keep stamping the feet, trying to make yourself move. So yeah, very shortly after that photo was taken, he was in his aircraft and gone. Oh, sorry. The fellow sitting to his right, the guy with the slight lean, that fellow is the second highest scoring ace of the squadron. He had 15. Frank was the highest with 16. I noticed in some of my research, the other fellow's actually attributed as saying he's got the highest score, but that same article then says he has 15 and Frank had 16, so I don't know how they do their sums. Different school of mathematics than what I went to. And there were a couple of notable aces in there, in that one, and there was another fellow there, Aubrey, I think, his name was, and he only had one leg. Lost the lower half of one leg. And that guy had actually petitioned King George V personally to allow him to go flying. And one of the things that picked me up on this a little while ago, you all will have heard of the Historical Aircraft Restoration Society down at Wollongong. A couple of years ago when I was down there, I used to do a bit of work for them and provide some support to the Haas Society. A fellow came down from Caloundra, and I believe this museum is no longer in existence, but the aircraft will be around, and he actually brought down a Fokker triplane, done up in the Barron's colours, of course, and he also brought down an S.E.5a, and it was done up in 2 squadrons' colours, and it was the aircraft representing the fellow with the one leg. And they flew them all the way down from Caloundra down there. So it took them about 3 days. They're not the fastest aircraft around. But that was really interesting to see those aircraft actually in the air, particularly the S.E.5a, which was the aircraft of this squadron. So that's the S.E.5a there. So a little bit about this particular aeroplane. You see a model of it here out the front that I brought in. Please note on that one, it has the red nose. That's actually Albert Ball's aircraft in that colour. And while we're talking about the models, the other one there obviously is the Sopwith Camel. That's quite a detailed model there. And the other thing I brought up, I was able to get a hold of, is this watch here. That's the watch of the Royal Flying Corps. They first issued in 1913. And most of the pilots, and they also adopted by the Australian Flying Corps, they carried this as their pilot's watch. The larger hand, it was easier to read, and it also had a second hand on there, so they were able to do their timings. And it also helped in the nav, I believe. So that's, it's not an actual one, that's actually a collector's edition of the watch. I wasn't able to get a hold of an original model, unfortunately. So the S.E.5a. Now the S.E.5a was the hot ship of the day. And I'm sure many of you are aware of its capabilities. We'll just run through very quickly on the S.E.5a. Probably the premier Allied fighter of the war. And it was quite a capable aircraft for what it was. And it was also quite a good stable platform. It's a pretty good gun platform. You can see there on the left the cockpit and what that looked like. And there shows both the guns. So you had a fixed one firing through the propeller with interrupter gear, and then you had the Lewis gun on the top, on the mount, that allowed them to bring the gun down, correct any jams, and also change the magazine, because it had a drum magazine on it, the large round one on the top. All 303 calibre, but they were a bit easier to get at than some of the other ones we actually had to stand up on them. This one pulled down so the pilot didn't have to actually stand up. and a few things that the aircraft could do. So you're looking at the water-cooled V8 inline engine. Originally at 150 horsepower, but they did get later models that went up to 200 horsepower. You're looking at a top speed of around just a bit under 140 miles an hour, so about 120 knots. It was pretty quick for its day. And a fairly, excuse me, a pretty reasonable range there, out to 300 miles or 260 nautical miles, and an endurance of around 3 hours. That was pretty good for its day. They also had a pretty high service ceiling. Now, in this publication, it came out, it said 17,000. In others, I've seen them say the aircraft could go as high as 22,000. And that's, I suspect it's somewhere around about the 20 to 22,000 was probably more towards its maximum ceiling height. Because the aircraft was regularly used as the higher level cap for patrols. And they were regularly flying at above 15,000. I think most of them, the planned cap was around about 16,000 feet. And then they'd have another formation flying underneath them at around 14,000 and another one below that at about 12,000 feet. Now, as you're probably aware, you start getting up much over, particularly over 10, but especially over 12,000, the air starts to get pretty thin. And it also gets bloody cold. And these guys are patrolling for hours in those conditions. So hypoxia becomes a real issue. The cold becomes a real issue. And we haven't even started mentioning those Fokkers that come out of the sun. So some pretty tough conditions, but in a very capable aircraft. And as you possibly are aware, the aircraft proved itself not only good at high altitude, she was a good medium to low level aircraft. It was quite manoeuvrable for its size. And it was also a pretty good stable gun platform. So it was also used in the ground attack role. And the thing was also it could carry a couple of bombs. So they did quite a bit of that towards the end of the war. Now, I talked about those 3 layers. This is something that came out about a wing. And they actually were experimenting with this wing formation as opposed to the early stages of the war where it was kind of an individual thing. They went out in little flights, so they went out in individual, or they went out as squadrons, but they were all separate and doing different things. And they started to coordinate themselves more when it came in about 1918 and through, and started to learn some more lessons about how they could better protect themselves and be far more effective in the air if they flew in the wings. I stress there again, so I spoke about the 16, 14, 12,000 feet. They were the prescribed. They're obviously up and down a little bit around that depending on what was going on and who they'd see, but it was still a fairly decent formation. And on a good clear day, you would expect that the enemy would be able to see a lot of that too. So it actually frightened them off. Once they started tangling with these wings and realising that there was a lot more in it than just the old flight or a squadron sitting down here at this level, there might be another one up there and another one somewhere around off the side or below me or somewhere. So they started to avoid the wings and would only try and take these guys out if they got separated, got alone, that sort of thing. So I think that impacted on a number of the guys from the squadron that operate in that area where they didn't get quite the scores that some of their counterparts did in other areas, or even the Germans themselves got, because you actually did see some pretty high scores, 20s, 30s, and as far as Richthofen with 80. That was a far more difficult thing when the enemy started to get a bit more scarce around the air and was less willing to take on these sort of formations. They were more after smaller groups and then take them on that way. So the fact that he was able to come across as many as he did and get involved in as many scopes as he did is fairly unique, and for them as well. And then, of course, you've got to throw in what was the weather like. So they're flying through winters, it wasn't all summer. And so the weather would not have always been that terribly favourable for them either. And I will just mention again about, for these guys, particularly with 2 Squadron being tasked with the higher level, so they're in the S.E.5s, the lower levels were usually manned by camels, flying camels. So like this aircraft out the front here. as we all know, the Camel's a bloody good aircraft. Probably not quite as stable as the S.E.5, but that actually often worked in their favour because most aerobatic aircraft are not necessarily the most stable of aircraft, and that's what benefits them with their aerobatics. And they operated much better at that medium to low level, so it made sense that they often flew the high cap in the S.E.5 and then would come down. But that meant, as I said, long periods in the thin, cold air, and they're fighting off hypoxia, they're fighting off the cold, they've got to maintain their attention, looking for enemy, they're also looking out for the people that are below them, making sure that they're in relative contact. Are they in a good spot? If these guys get pounced, are they in a good spot to be able to then pounce on the enemy? So there's a lot of things that they had to keep aware of and keep thinking of and keep themselves focused for fairly extensive periods of time. Now, part of my military life in the latter stages of my career, I worked in the parachute world, and I was the parachute safety officer for the Army, for Special Operations Command and for Defence. And we often spoke about the effects of hypoxia. It's one of the things we were teaching. For those that did high altitude jumping, they had to be well aware of it, of what those effects were. So understanding what this is, what are the onsets, how do you function, how do you maintain yourself with it, and what can you do to try and maintain sufficient alertness and keep yourself awake, so that you can then react when you need to. Because, as you're probably aware, especially in these things, they don't get a lot of time to react. Once something happens, it happens fast. And you haven't got really time to shake the fog of it out of your head and take 5 or 10 seconds to think about it, because in 5 or 10 seconds you're going down in flames. Or you could be. So there was quite a battle for these guys. And I've got to say it's taught me a level of respect for what they did and how they managed that and how these guys were able to fight through. Now, we spoke a bit about some of the aircraft that he hit, and his first 2 aircraft were the false 3. So that's it there, that's what it looks like. Not a bad fighter when it first came out, but certainly not in the same league as this one. So we'll just rattle through where he picked up his scores. So it was a fairly active time through that period, July reading right into October. So, and he started hitting the D7, the Fokker D7. And I'll show you a bit about them in a minute. But the D7 was arguably the best Axis fighter, German fighter of the war. A very capable machine and pretty much on a par with the S.E.5. And we'll show those statistics in a minute. But he got most of his kills against the D7s. And the D7s are also flown by a lot of the better pilots and the more experienced pilots, German pilots. And I'll show you a couple of those in a bit. So on the 6th of September, he became an ace. And then he got to D2s, that's right, D7s. That should be D7. Sorry, I've missed out the V. I'll fix that. And by September, he's now a flight commander. So he's not just one of the guys flying along. He's quite experienced by this stage. He's established himself as a pretty aggressive kind of guy in the air, but a calm aggressive. Now, there were plenty of guys out there who were pretty aggressive and looking for a fight. Not too many of them actually made it through, as it turns out. You still needed to maintain a level of calm in your aggression and be able to channel that to achieve what you needed to achieve. And Frank had shown that many times. So they made him a flight commander, and he really seemed to excel. The more pressure he got, the better he seemed to perform, particularly in his leadership roles. And he became even more focused, which is a great thing. There in the beginning of October, 80 Wing moved from Rockingham to Cerny, I'm not sure of the pronunciation. And then he got back in and he's picked up an Albatross and then back into the D7s, and he's now got 12 by that stage. Now, this is the D7s. There's a couple of photos of the D7s. Does anyone recognise the 2 gentlemen standing there? On the right, exactly right, that's Hermann Goering. A little bit slimmer in those days, wasn't he? Interestingly, see the stick, the walking stick that he's holding? That's von Richthofen's walking stick. He managed to snaffle when the guy didn't come back. The other fella here is Hans Udet. Now these both are two highly qualified aces and incredible pilots in their own right, particularly Udet. And from some of the stuff I picked up on, Udet was arguably one of the best, if not the best, of the German fighters. And they all flew the D7s. So this is the kind of quality that these guys, 2 Squadron, was up against day after day after day. And as I said, quite a remarkable aircraft. That's a little bit about it. So it was a little bit slower, by about 10 or so knots, 12 knots slower. But in a dogfight, that didn't always make all the difference. A few knots wasn't always good, unless you wanted to get away. Top speed of around 110 knots, as is shown there. Not quite as good on the range and endurance as the S.E.5, but close. They had a pretty decent service ceiling as well, so they could certainly get up above and operate well above 15,000 feet. So when you're talking about our guys operating at around about the 16,000, 17,000 foot mark, these guys were certainly capable of that. Up much higher, it probably got a little bit more separated between their abilities, but I don't think it was too great. So they're pretty close. It had a pretty good rate of climb too, with that BMW engine in it. And it had the 2 machine guns too. So roughly equivalent arms. I believe these guys also carried some small bombs. I don't know if their carrying capacity was quite the same as the S.E.5, but that didn't really matter in a dogfight. They were more a hindrance, you get rid of those. So we're pretty equally matched here, and it really starts to come down to the skill of the pilot and the skill of the guy and just how good a shot he was once he got himself into a position to be able to take a shot in the first place. And that was probably 90% of the skill. And that was the other type of aircraft he put down, the Albatross. Now that was a 2-seater. They were more a reconnaissance aircraft than a fighter. But you didn't want to be slightly off in your aircraft recognition and come in behind and suddenly find that there's a gun pointing at you at the back. So you still had to be quick. On the 13th of October, he put down 2 more. And then on the 14th of October, it was a pretty big day for him. On this particular occasion, I don't know why, but on this particular occasion, the element being led by Frank were not the high cap. They were actually the low cap. And he spotted a formation of aircraft, of German aircraft, but from what he could see, they had not picked up the high cap. So he then manoeuvred his flight into a disadvantageous position relative to the Germans. And the whole aim of that was to then draw the Germans down on top of him before they caught sight of the high cap. And he was also positioning that such that when the Germans did come down, the high cap was in a good position to be able to come down and take out the Germans. So he led them into a trap. And this is all going on in his head, in moments, working out all those vectors, and in he goes. And he actually got them into the trap. They did come down, and the high cap came down on top of them. And he got 2 of them. And they were able to dispatch 4 aircraft all up that day. And I don't believe our guys lost any. So it was a pretty good one. For his leadership in the air, and in those conditions, on that particular day, they also linked in the citation his leadership prior to that, but particularly on that day, his leadership in the air, and he was awarded the DFC. So now a fairly unique set of medals sitting up there on that chest. But he wasn't the only one. There were a few others up there. that fellow that I indicated earlier, that it was the number 2 or the ace of the squadron, he actually had 2 MCs as well as a DFC. So there's some pretty distinguished guys in the group. But in that day, there he goes. And then on the 22nd of October, he was promoted to captain. Kind of unique day because that's the day my father was born. Not in 1918, no. It was just a few years later than that. 1924, my dad was born, but the 22nd of October. And there he was, promoted to captain. And now we're getting into early November, and as you know, war's getting close to the end. And things were pretty much in a disarray across the front by this stage. But they were still out doing their patrols. But for most of it now, there was very little opposition in the air. So these guys were spending more and more time in the ground attack role. Particularly as the Germans were withdrawing or just running away. Lots of activity on the railway lines, lots of activities on the roads, and these guys would go and say, this is great shooting. And for many cases it was. And so out they are on the 9th of November, and he's leading a patrol out, and they attacked a train at Engheim. And I wasn't able to pull out the photo, unfortunately, but I actually have a photo in the biography here of the train that he actually hit and just tore apart. But the other thing about getting down that low, these guys are flying down to around 50 and sometimes as low as 20 feet. So that's really low. What does that also do? Puts you right smack in the firing line for ground fire, particularly machine gun and rifle fire. And it was actually machine gun fire that got him. So on the 9th of November, just after he hit that train, he got machine gun fire, and that came up through the bottom of the aircraft, through his cockpit, and shattered his control panel. And that brought him down. He was able to get the aircraft down. He was about 200 yards from the Germans, and they were after him before he had a chance to set the aircraft on fire, and he ran towards a farmhouse, and he actually got himself inside a haystack and hid in the haystack, and they didn't find him. After they'd given up the chase, he came out of the haystack and approached the farm, and the Belgian family in there didn't take him in to the home, but they took him into a barn, gave him some clothes for him to get changed into some dirty old clothes. Now, he also spoke a bit of French, pretty broken, but he was able to speak some French. So the son of the family there helped him take it through, and he's written quite a detailed report. It's a handwritten report as to what he did with this and what the family did and the others that helped him subsequently to escape. Now, on that day, he became the last casualty of the Australian Flying Corps and the last casualty of his squadron. And it took him 3 days to get back to the squadron. So he got back to the squadron on the 12th of November. Now, there are a couple of things, and I get this from the family side. So again, very, very few details from the family side on this. But one of the things that did come out of this was the things that he saw while he was actually on the ground. It was one of the things that he'd seen in the air and seen what's happened in the air, and watching the German army start to fall apart. But what he actually saw on the ground probably affected him more than anything else that he'd seen, where he was able to see up very close just how bad it was for the Germans on the ground and in what sort of disarray and how bad their morale was at the time. And one of the incidents he did describe to my dad was at one point from his hiding place, he saw a German section try to run away, and their section commander had drawn his weapon and was trying to hold the guys back, and he watched the section beat and kick this guy to death. Actually, absolutely tore him apart like savage animals. And that's how it was amongst them. They were doing this all over the front. And so he was watching that. It was pretty horrific. But he got himself back and he fronted up to the squadron on the 12th. Now, at this point, they had him down missing in action, presumed dead. He goes up to the mess and knocks on the door, and the mess is in a party. And the guys at the door, when he opened up, What are you doing here? We thought you were dead. There's a guy down in your room packing up your gear to send home to your mum. And he said, we better stop that. There's no truth in the rumour. Here I am. Now, what the hell's going on here? And they said, mate, the war ended at 11 o'clock yesterday morning. You want a drink? And so had a drink and got himself cleaned up. And that was his introduction to the end of the war. Now, they kicked on in Belgium for a little while. And one of the things he found himself doing was they were testing German aircraft. So anything that was captured, these guys were flying to run assessments on them and writing reports on the aircraft. And he was actually one of those guys flying those aircraft and doing those assessments on the aircraft. And eventually got back to England, and then eventually back to Australia. And he got back to Australia in June of 1919. As it says there, by this stage he's now the highest scoring ace of the squadron with 16. He's the fourth highest scoring ace of the Australian Flying Corps. And some of the things and the actions that he got involved in 1919 leading into 1920, he got himself involved in the fledgling Australian Air Corps. And they did put on some demonstration flights, and he did some things in Queensland. And this is where Queensland really adopted him. Now, yes, he came from Toowoomba, so Queensland boy anyway. And he was really taken on as one of Queensland's home heroes. Now we get into, let's step away from that for a little bit. We get into post-1920. And here's where the story changes. So, a couple of things on Frank. At the end of that war, he was a pretty shattered guy. He was a strong Catholic, but what he had seen, particularly in that last stage, sorry, I'll step back, really questioned his faith. And he actually lost his faith, and to the best of my knowledge, he never fully regained it. I believe he tried a couple of times, he just couldn't get his head around it. How could God be on both sides? You know, how could he allow such terrible things to happen to both sides? So he never really got that faith back. Now there's another thing that comes up, and this is where, when I spoke about this biography, I had a long chat with the author last week, and he's done a fantastic amount of research. And there's quite a bit of detail in that biography about the Francis Ryan Frank Smith leading up until his death in 1962. That is not my grandfather. Excuse me. At the end of the war, Dad returned with a few people from his squadron. One of those guys was also a Queenslander and went to North Queensland. Whilst in North Queensland, so the family legend goes, he adopted my grandfather's name and credentials. And he continued to do things under Frank's name. And it caused a bit of trouble at one point up in Cairns, and he got himself into some trouble. In order for my grandfather to disassociate himself from those troubles, he changed his name. Kept the Christian name because there were just a few of us Smiths around the place. But he changed his name from Francis Ryan to Valentine Frederick. But I believe this guy, well, they certainly knew each other quite well, and he actually spent some time with my grandfather post-war, and he met my grandfather's cousin, and he married her. Now, according to the history, Frank married his first cousin. He didn't. Certainly not as far as the family is concerned. This was the other fellow. And then he went on, and he eventually got himself over to China, and he did a number of things in China, and he had connected with aviation, and he stayed in the aviation world right throughout the rest of his life as Frank. Frank, my grandfather, now Valentine, settled in Sydney, and he married his wife, Irene, and they, during the Depression, moved to Melbourne, chasing work. And also during that period, he sold his medals, as many of them did, to have enough money to survive and maintain the family. And in that period, he had 3 children. There was Edna first, then my dad in 24. His name's Ronald Frederick. And then another daughter, Carmel. Now, in that period, Frank denied his service. And as far as the family were concerned, he never served, he was never fit enough to serve. Only his wife knew. And the kids grew up thinking their father had never served, he wasn't fit enough to serve. But he did go into the Air Force during World War II as an admin officer, and he served as, I believe, a squadron leader. And it was through those contacts that he actually got my father into the Air Force. My dad was an apprentice in a protected industry and was barred from enlisting. But because of his father's contacts, he got him enlisted. And as soon as he got enlisted in the Air Force, he applied for flying training. And he went through his flying training as one of the most air-sick candidates they'd ever had, but still got through, finished as a sergeant pilot, and off he went. And he ended up flying Beaufighters in New Guinea. Now, he was part of the Empire Flying Training Scheme. And as you may be aware, those guys did their initial flight crew training here in Australia, then went to Canada, did their bomber conversion, then off to Bomber Command in Europe, and away they went from there. He and one other fellow were pulled off their course before they went to Canada, saved his life. He went on to Beaufighters and then into 30 Squadron in New Guinea and flew Beaufighters in there. His classmates from his flying training course went to Canada, into Bomber Command, and every single one of them was killed. Not one survived. 4 minutes, okay. Thank you. So that probably saved his life. When he came back at the end of his tour, and he was then identified to go on a second tour, and there's another story here because he was identified to go to a bow squadron, but ended up in a bow fort, not a bow fighter, and was not trained in the aircraft, but he still had to learn on the job. Before he went, that's when his father sat down and told him about his service and then swore him to secrecy. No one was to know. And so it stayed a family secret until about 2014, I think, was when my dad told me, not long before my dad passed. And he told me about his dad. So that's how I learned about Frank. By this stage, his mum had passed also, so the only person who knew the real story was my dad. And of course, my dad's now gone. He died in 2014. Passed on to me and then told me to shut my mouth and not say anything. So we sat on that for a while. But what I did get was his records. I then went and saw his sister, Edna, who was still alive, and with my 2 cousins, and said, here's our shared grandfather and here's your dad. And they went, no, never served. I said, yes, he did. This is Frank. And his name was Frank. And this is what it was about. And you could have knocked him over with a feather. And just to confirm things, I looked at the photographs. I asked them to look at the photographs of what they knew of him, grandfather, her father, through their growing up years, compared to what he was in 2 Squadron and in 1919, and they said, that's the same guy. So as far as the family is concerned, that's Frank. Now, Valentine. Who this other fellow is, I don't know. How that history works out, I don't know. It's going to be a bit of searching to see what happened. But that's where we are. That was Frank. And that's what he did. And I thank you very much for listening. Thank you.